Tortures, human rights violations, absolutely awful things that happened under Russian occupation. Well, I looked at my phone and there was missed calls from the office, and so I called them, and they obviously wanted me to be on live as soon as possible. And my first reaction was, I'm not going outside. People ran because they heard the sirens. This lady who's just come to work and has realized that there's no work because there's war. And I became very confident that this was a massive bluff and that it wasn't going to happen. An absolutely unjustified, brutal and horrific invasion of a sovereign country. My name is Gulliver Cragg. I'm English. I was born in London, but I started my journalistic career basically in France, working first of all for English language French radio and then for France24. 3 years in Paris working in the office there. I moved to Poland first of all, where I was correspondent working for the French and English channels, and my zone, as it were, of coverage was Poland, Ukraine, Hungary and Belarus. And that was now 12 years ago, and I'm still doing the same job, except that in 2014, because of everything that was happening in Ukraine, I moved to Ukraine, and so Kyiv became my base, but I still was, traveling around these 4 countries all the time. I had been covering Ukraine since 2010. The first report that I did about Ukraine was the election campaign for the 2010 election, when Yanukovych won in a more or less free and fair election. And after that, I was following the development of the Yanukovych presidency and very much aware of the increasing levels of corruption and the fears that there were of authoritarian drift. And so we were like rooting for the Ukrainians, absolutely. Like when the Maidan first started, we were like, get rid of these bastards who've reneged on their promise to sign the association agreement with the European Union. Throughout that year, 2013, I was following the developments of the potential signing of that association agreement. I did a report about it in August when the Russians first, I think they closed the border and or made it very difficult for Ukraine to export to Russia in order to put pressure, if you remember. So I was really following it and thinking it would be so amazing if people protested against this terrible behavior of the Yanukovych government and pressure from the Russians, and I didn't believe it would happen, and then it did happen, and we were super excited. At the beginning of the Maidan protests, we were like, wow, come on guys. We were really surprised and pleased to see so many people coming out into the streets to protest, because we thought that it was, I'm saying me and most of my other Western journalist friends, thought that it was absolutely right to protest against this government because it was clearly stealing money from the Ukrainian people in huge quantities. I'd been in 2013, in the beginning of the year, actually, I did a report in Donbass about the Kopanki and how, as it turned out, I don't think we were able to completely prove it, but it seemed pretty clear that Alexander Yanukovych, Viktor Yanukovych's son, was taking a huge percentage of money from this illegal mining, which is illegal and also extremely dangerous. And it really felt like, the mafia was running the country. And so when the Maidan protest started, we were super pleased that people were protesting and standing up for their rights.
I did see protesters trying to resist the column of riot police that was pushing them away from their demonstration in front of the government offices about 1 kilometre away from Independence Square here earlier on. At the moment, though, the police have not started trying to dismantle the barricades that are actually surrounding Independence Square, the epicenter of the protest, but they are on the edges of the square to be seen. And the word that's been given to the protesters from people speaking on the stage is to be as nice to the police as you possibly can. Go and offer them a cup of tea, tell them that you're sorry that it's so cold, and try to really put the emphasis on the fact that this is a peaceful demonstration.
I think everybody is really wanting to see what's going to happen and really anxious to see how this is going to end and when it's going to end. But if it descends into some kind of frozen conflict and things aren't changing, it's quite hard to keep people's interest, because there are lots of other things in the world going on that are changing and that take priority, and there's only a certain amount of stories that media can have in their bulletins. So I don't know, but at the moment that really doesn't look like happening, right? I don't see any freezing of this conflict, or even kind of simmering down to the low-level, low-intensity conflict that there was in Donbass for all those years. I don't see that happening at the moment, and so I don't think that interest is going to fade. I was in London for Christmas when I had my darkest thoughts about how I thought that he was really going to go ahead with it, Putin. I kind of worked out a logic that he had come to the conclusion that Ukrainians would never again vote for a pro-Russian government. And he had been up until this point hoping, Putin, that some Medvedchuk-type character would eventually be elected president of Ukraine and he'd be able to control Ukraine that way. And that if he had come to the conclusion that it could not be done by political manipulation and he could not accept the idea of Russia losing control of Ukraine, then he would definitely try to do it by force. I remember in London having conversations with people there who were very incredulous and thinking, of course he wouldn't really do it, you know, and I was the guy there saying, no, I really think he might, you know, I really think he might. And then in January, I can't remember what I read or who I talked to or what made me change my mind, but I started to think that Putin must know that this would ultimately be a disaster for him, and therefore this whole thing must be that he's bluffing, that he's trying to really threaten this use of force in order to get what he wants in Ukraine somehow, in order to get the US to kind of decide that they don't want to back Ukraine, in fact that it's not worth it or whatever, it's not worth the risk, and that this is all a massive bluff. And I became very confident that this was a massive bluff and that it wasn't going to happen, and I stuck to this kind of view until the speech on, when was it, 21st of February, when he recognized the DNR and LNR, and then I knew, obviously, from that point it was clear that they were going to attack. But even then I thought maybe they were just attacking Donbass. That's what a lot of Ukrainian experts were saying, that they would attack in Donbass and try to destabilize the country with cyber attacks elsewhere. I was still kind of surprised on the 24th of February when, like, right away they were attacking not only Kyiv, but targets in western Ukraine as well. Well, I looked at my phone and there was missed calls from the office, and so I called them and they obviously wanted me to be on live as soon as possible. And my first reaction was, I'm not going outside because I can hear explosions. So I said, okay, but by Skype from indoors, you know, and I think I did 1 or 2 lives from indoors by Skype. Just based on what I was, you know, reading online, basically, and then they said, do you think you could maybe go out into the street? And I was like, okay, realizing that probably it wasn't really so dangerous in the center of Kyiv. And then I did some lives in the street, and then it was, you know, there was people walking in the street. Yeah, I was quite bewildered, just like everyone around. You know, I was kind of, oh, there's people walking around, maybe I could speak to them to see what they're saying. And it seemed really odd to go up to people thinking that I know what you're thinking, but I kind of have to ask you what you're thinking in order to be able to quote you in some way. And I asked a couple of people, and basically all that day I was doing live reports, right? All the time. There was one that I remember outside this museum on Bogdana Khmelnytskaya Street. I can't remember what it is the museum of, but a lady had come to work who works at the museum, and I guess she hadn't heard the explosions, and I guess she didn't have internet on her phone or wasn't listening to the radio or anything, so she came to work and found it to be closed, and only then, like, looked up what was going on and found out, you know. And so I was able to tell this story in my live, that right next to me there's this lady who's just come to work and has realized that there's no work because there's war. And I went to the bus station because people were fleeing. And there I did a little bit of filmed some interviews with people who were waiting for buses. And then the sirens went off. First time I heard the sirens. And people ran. There was crowds at the bus station near the railway station. And people ran because they heard the sirens. And I unfortunately didn't hold my camera and film them as they ran in order to get the image. I also was scared and ran. First time you hear the sirens, you don't know what it means. So you kind of, to my mind, it like made me immediately think of something like the Blitz in London, where there's planes flying over and dropping bombs completely indiscriminately. You know, after a while you come to realize that most of the time in a place like Kyiv, if there's a siren, it means there's a missile that's probably heading for some kind of infrastructure target. And if you're not near, I mean, obviously you need to, you know, doesn't mean you necessarily need to run for cover right away. And at that time I did, though. I just ran for cover, and then I spoke to a taxi driver saying, what do you think I should do? Shall I need to edit this stuff which I filmed, but maybe I should just go and hide and stuff. And he was like, you probably be all right if you just drive home. And I did, yeah. And I'm sure that nowadays, if there's a siren goes off and people are at the bus station, it's no way the kind of movement of the crowd suddenly running away like there was on that first day, because everybody was in the same situation, that they were experiencing this for the very first time. Objectivity also means that you have to, recognize that the Ukrainians are also engaged in an information war, and they might not always think that telling the truth is their best strategy, and they might be right in thinking that telling the truth is not always their best strategy. But you, as a journalist, have to, bear that in mind, and you have to be telling the truth. But telling the truth is also, it's very much, and I also find it's often, in my case, a little bit of correcting the presenters in Paris, who will tend to, especially because of the way it's reported, by Reuters and AFP, say the Russians say this, and I find myself sometimes on air saying, well, the Russians say this, but think of all the things the Russians have said, which turned out to be completely not true. So I don't know, without any evidence of this coming from anywhere else than the Russians say this, I don't think we shouldn't, don't think there's any reason to think that it's true. But I also think that the general principle of Ukraine being the country that has truth on its side is really worth Ukrainian officials bearing in mind, and that sometimes telling the truth about something that reflects badly on Ukraine in some way may be worth it for them for the sake of maintaining credibility. Because at the moment, Ukraine has a much higher level of credibility than Russia, but it doesn't have top perfect credibility, right? It's certainly journalists are aware that you can't necessarily take what Ukrainian officials say as face value. And I kind of would encourage the Ukrainians to think that it's really worth having the reputation of being the guys who tell the truth. But I also sometimes think that that's a little bit of a naive position for me to have as a Westerner. Not naive maybe, but naive's not the word. But I also sometimes think that's a bit of a utopian position for me to have. Anton Herashchenko the other day tweeted about this. Yeah. But look how many people retweet him, and look how many Western journalists, because he's so helpful to us. It's like, I don't know, most Western journalists, I guess, didn't know him before. I've known him, I've known who he is for a long time. I've met him a few times, and I kind of know that he's not a very trustworthy guy, but he's also lately very helpful in giving you contacts and trying to get access for journalists and stuff. So you feel kind of grateful to him. And then perhaps that makes people more inclined to retweet things that he tweeted. But the other day he tweeted about these protests in Moscow, about Moscow city center being closed off. Did you see this? It was a complete lie.
I think, yeah, I've seen that, and then everybody was like, there's no reports, this is the only source, so... Yeah,
but thousands of people, including journalists, retweeted it unquestioningly. You've really got to be careful of things like that. With Reuters, I think there's a problem, and I think maybe there's a problem that is to do with the agreement that they had with TASS. I tend to think that most of the time it's due to sloppiness and people not thinking, rather than some kind of deeper pro-Russian narrative that they're trying to push in any kind of deliberate way. I guess there's a bit of a feeling I have at the moment that everyone's attention has turned to what's going on the military front, what's going on in Kherson, A, and B, the long-range attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, the power cuts and everything, and that has probably distracted attention from the tortures, human rights violations, absolutely awful things that happened under Russian occupation, particularly in Kharkiv Oblast, because now so much of that has been revealed. And I think probably, yeah, that there should be more attention on that, because in a way the world's eyes moved on too quickly. But probably if you look up for stories about that, there are stories being generated every day about it. They're just not getting the top headlines because people's attention is focused on the latest developments. I do worry about how to make each report different from one another, you know? I mean, you already saw they liberated Izium, and they found all the graves of the people who'd been killed, and it was a huge story. Look how many international media were there. It was almost like a media circus. It was really quite hard to even film without having journalists in your shot and everything, because everybody was there. They also discovered, I think, 120 graves in Liman. Similarly unclear how these people died, similarly exhuming them in order to investigate, and that didn't get nearly as much attention because people think, okay, well, it's basically the same. On the other hand, it's like one also needs to find a way to make people realize the volume of this, the scale of this, that there was 400 and something just outside Izium, 120 something in Liman, and there are other sites that have been found, and you need to be able to cover these things and to make reports about them in order for people to realize the full scale, that it's not just this one burial site in Izium that was found.
A body is pulled from its grave, and the criminologist begins the examination. First, the clothes. Civilian. Soon, it becomes apparent that the man has injuries to his genital area.
Ушкодження з лінійними краями, довжиною 3 см, яке проходить
He beckons a colleague to take a look.
у порожнину колиски.
They're clearly disturbed by what they see.
Зважаючи на гнилісний стан трупу.
Due to the rotten state of the body, examination suspended. That's it. It's enough, really.
І так.
Sometimes I think we as journalists think, okay, well, I've done that, I'm not going to do it again. And I think actually sometimes you just have to think, well, yeah, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to make a report which is going to be very similar to the one that I made in Izium, but we have to do it because this is what's happening, and probably lots and lots of people did not watch the first report that you made, and so they won't be thinking you're just repeating yourself. And also you can find obviously different words to tell the same story and different pictures. So you can try to be a bit more specific, right? You can say something like, out of X thousand homes in Izium, X thousand are considered not rebuildable, or something, to be a bit more precise. And sometimes you have to dig out a bit more information in order to say something more precise, rather than just saying the kind of cliched phrase that the town is in ruins.
Ever since this whole movement started, Molly, Ukrainians have been coming up to us as foreign journalists here in Kyiv and thanking us for being here and drawing attention to the situation, and asking again and again the same question: when is Western Europe going to introduce sanctions? They've been calling for that for weeks. There have also been pickets calling for sanctions. Ukrainians care very, very much about whether the world is watching and whether the world will act.
I get the feeling that there is a stronger and stronger consolidation of a pro-Ukrainian position among the French elites. And you know, you're talking about the French centre-right Gaullist political elites, people like François Fillon, who ran for president and was defeated by Macron however many years ago, 2017. You know, these are people with close ties to Russia, and traditionally Jacques Chirac, the former president, was a guy who, you know, like to develop good relations with Russia. Catherine Colonna, who's now the foreign minister, was foreign minister under Chirac, and I think that these are people who've kind of gone on a journey from, you know, changing their attitudes to Russia and realizing that they just aren't going to be able to get anything out of trying to have good relations or any kind of diplomatic relations with Vladimir Putin's regime. And so I think that their support for Ukraine is getting stronger. But I'm like totally not an expert on French politics, and I don't really know. I mean, in terms of public opinion, you've got the anti-American left in France, who are just instinctively wanting to see something bad and something to blame America for, and who will try to go for the sort of, well, yes, of course Russia is bad, but America's bad too. They shouldn't have expanded NATO and all of this rubbish, and don't realize how much they're just parroting Russian propaganda about this and stuff. But I just try to avoid those people, to be honest. I was invited to speak at over Skype. It was like in March. they had a screening of a film about the Holodomor, that film, not very good film, Agnieszka Holland did, what's it called, Mr. Jones.
Я журналіст. Чернозем. Так його назвала моя мама. Черноземный край. Мог бы и прокормить мир. Пожалуйста, скажи мне, что случилось.
Как вы думаете, что случилось? Они убивают нас.
Local cinema in France, people I know, these are very kind of left-wing people. They run these kind of alternative European cinema type things, and they asked me to speak. And then the people were asking me questions, of course, about Ukrainian nationalists and how strong are Ukrainian far-right nationalists and these kinds of questions, you know. And I answered them like saying, you've really got to stop seeing these Ukrainian nationalists in the same way as you see French nationalists, because French nationalists are people who are racist and anti-immigration, and it's a nationalism of hate, you know, and Ukrainian nationalism is a nationalism of defending your country because your country's under attack, and however much you want to agree with them or not, you really have to see that there's a really important difference here. And they were all like, oh wow, that was such an important point. It was like they really liked this answer and said it really made them think. I think that like a lot of people in Western Europe had a certain sort of wariness about anything that seems like Ukrainian nationalism, because they compare it to their own nationalisms in their own countries, which are much more about, you know, being racist, authoritarian, and anti-democratic, anti-European. You know, the fact that in Ukraine you can be a nationalist and pro-European is like, oh wow, what's this, you know? In Western Europe they need to like think a little bit in order to understand. In terms of broader understanding of the country, the easy mistake to make, which loads of journalists make, is that there's like a Russian-speaking minority in this country who are in danger of being in some way repressed by the Ukrainian speakers, and what people need to realize that it's more the Ukrainian speakers in Ukraine who felt like they were oppressed, who felt like they had to feel embarrassed to speak their own language for years and years and years. And even now, you know, only just now it's beginning to be that, you know, people don't feel sort of looked down upon for speaking Ukrainian, and it's like a really long journey that the Ukrainian language is on, and that it's positive discrimination that is going on in terms of discriminating in favor of the Ukrainian language, and that also a huge proportion of Russian speakers in Ukraine would be very happy if their children spoke Ukrainian. And so the whole like language dynamic and conflict around that is, it's not that it's like a non-issue in Ukraine. Some people like come to Ukraine and get told that it's a non-issue. It's not like it's a non-issue in my view, but it's an issue that people need to understand in like a pretty much the other way around than the way lots of people who come with kind of you know, basic ideas about how these things usually work understand it. I think probably most of the civilized democratic Western world is rooting for Ukrainian victory. I think that was how most people would feel comfortable with putting it that way, because even when you are attached to the principle of objectivity, here we are looking at an objective situation where Ukraine, whatever its faults, whatever its problems, did not deserve to be invaded. This was a completely unprovoked invasion, and this is something that everybody should be really standing together to fight against. And I think that you can perfectly well be a journalist sticking to the principle of objectivity and of telling the truth, whilst also being quite clear about the fact that you know, we're not on Russia's side here. There's only a few of us foreign correspondents who live here the whole time, unlike lots of people who are coming in and visiting. And I think for us who live here, it's that much more traumatic, not as traumatic as for people who are actually Ukrainian, but to some degree, you know, it's also really, really hard. And while some people might be coming here and finding this exciting or just interesting and good for their careers, I don't feel like that. I just feel like I just really, really want it to end. And I don't mind saying also that I really want it to end with a Ukrainian victory, and then to be covering stories about the reconstruction of this country. And I don't think it's a contradiction with wanting to be objective and stick to telling the truth as a journalist, to be clear in this case whose side we're on. because clearly this was, you know, just an absolutely unjustified, brutal and horrific invasion of a sovereign country, and also what the Russian armed forces are doing here is just absolutely shocking and awful, and of course we all want it to end as soon as possible. I love riding on the trains. They're so comfortable. I love the very, very strong instant coffee in the morning, and also, I mean, I already loved Železnice before the war, but now I just think that they have been absolute heroes in evacuating people and keeping the trains running even when it's dangerous, even when the power supply is cut. I came back, I went to Poland for the weekend, and I came back on the train from Helm on Tuesday morning. As we were coming into Kyiv, Kyiv was, I think there was a air alert on at the time when the train was coming into Kyiv, and throughout the night there'd been several across Ukraine. And the train was not even on time, it was 3 minutes early. How do they do it? In England, if there's like, if the temperature falls below 0 or above 30, the trains don't run because they say the weather conditions don't permit it. You know, in Ukraine, it's just unbelievable how they managed to keep everything going.